All right, so this is my kind of about me slide. So, I've kind of mentioned to you all that I've worked in software for engineering in the past. So what's on screen is a whole bunch of the different kind of engineering assets that I've essentially provided software or worked directly with. So I've worked kind of through aerospace, automotive, oil and gas, chemicals, and also down to kind of the micro scale with electronic chip design. Tend to enjoy the bigger scale stuff more, hence kind of the work that I'm doing at the moment. But most of my career up till about 4 years ago, when I became a diversity and inclusion professional, was really about making information management software for kind of huge scale engineering projects. So data has been very much kind of a strand through my career, which I think I now take into the diversity and inclusion work that I do, and that kind of understanding of how to make use of data with it. So just to set the frame a little bit of what does engineering in the UK look like from a diversity perspective. And this kind of spans, STEM more generally, focuses on tech a bit, focuses on engineering a bit. So this slide's fairly general. But what you can see is that it shows a whole lifespan, really, of somebody from their early years through to kind of reaching the most senior levels of global and national engineering organizations. And actually what we can see is that at every stage where someone makes a decision about what's next in what I do, people who don't quite fit the norm fall away a little bit. And this is often called the leaky pipeline. It's like at each joint, each kind of intersection, we lose people who aren't quite fitting the mold of what's expected. And we actually can see choices emerging from children as young as 2 and 3 in the kind of toys that they're playing with. And actually fairly conclusive research has shown how that's not just about the children's innate preferences, it's also about how their caregivers encourage them and what they reward and what they give praise for. So by age 7, children are already beginning to show quite kind of gendered understanding of what jobs are what. There's a STEM outreach groups that will take unexpected people into schools and get them to guess what their careers are, and you'll see children making quite gendered, stereotyped guesses, who are then obviously completely shattered when they reveal what their jobs actually are. But by the time we're looking at qualifications, only 22% of computing students are girls. Looking at A-levels, actually chemistry and biology are often quite dominated by women. So even within the STEM subjects, it's not even, but physics is down at only 23%, computing even lower than that. By the time we get to university, only 16% of engineering students are women. And then this, of course, perpetuates into the workforce. And what I find often is that organisations will talk about there being a pipeline problem, meaning we can't find the people to come in. But actually, the pipeline problem continues as you move through a career once within an organisation as well. So on screen here, I've got kind of tech and engineering roles both shown, but then a focus on what happens with the tech side of roles. But the same is very much true for engineering roles as well. So in the tech side of things, we start with the overall kind of tech population being 19% women. By the time you're looking at tech leadership, so those in the executive teams of tech firms, that's dropped to only 5%, and even fewer if you're looking at chief technology officers, chief executive officers, chief operating officers types of roles. And the same happens within engineering careers, and actually it's also very much true of other minority groups. So we can see that within tech, again, we have 18% of the tech workforce coming from an ethnic minority background, which is sort of in proportion to what the UK workforce looks like, but not actually when you start disaggregating and looking at the different groups who are represented. And actually only 2% of the workforce are Black, which is about half the rate of the population. And again, this leaky pipeline is shown so that as we move through upwards in organisations to those more senior roles, that drops down to just 9%. We've kind of lost half of those people. And in part, this is because of people failing to progress, but it's also because people leave their careers at greater rates. So the exit rates of people from minority backgrounds are also higher than of the white men who are steadily working their way through their engineering careers. So trying to remember why I included this slide. I think I've got a little out of order here on my slide deck. So this kind of relates back to my own story, actually, about how I started getting involved working with people data. So after I'd been on maternity leave, actually, this is when it really began to dawn on me how people like me were in a minority at work. And the organisation I worked for did kind of company all hands fairly routinely. Kind of the executive team would go on a tour of all the offices and you'd get to ask them questions. And I decided that, when they came to visit our office, I was going to ask, well, diversity in engineering is a really big deal. I can see that there aren't really very many people like me in this organisation. What's our strategy about it? Then I got into the room and discovered, well, actually, everyone looks a lot like the Lego characters standing behind the Lego me. And the only other women in the room were either the executive assistants or people within marketing. And I totally chickened out. I didn't dare to ask my question. But then I immediately kind of regretted it afterwards and sent an email to the CTO. And it was a big enough organisation that was quite a daunting thing to do. I'd never been in direct contact with him before, and kind of asked my question by email. Kind of delighted when he replied and said, okay, so do you want to come and have a meeting about it? So I went and met with him and he said, do you want to get involved? I really want to make change to this because we can see that actually more diverse teams are much better at kind of covering the risk. We end up with far less of the kind of hero scenarios, that it's all or nothing approach. And actually, we can see how it really benefits us to have more diverse teams. So this is where I actually started working with data. I was still within my engineering role, but then looking at the people data for the organisation to understand more of what it looks like. And this is kind of what it looks like. So to explain, first up, it kind of shattered my illusions of just how the UK was doing as compared to other places in the world. I'd kind of assumed, well, we're pretty progressive, aren't we, in the UK? We know everything, very Western dominant mindset. Surely we're kind of leading the way on this. But actually quite quickly discovered, actually other countries, India in particular, had a far, far higher proportion of women in their tech roles than we did in the UK. And actually, this is generally true. These numbers are pretty much reflective of those national averages in both of those countries. What I also discovered was, if you look at kind of the job levels and the number of people in the different jobs, is you end up with normal-ish distributions looking like this. So the blue curve being the men, the red curve being the women. Obviously fewer women, but actually what you could also see is that the kind of average of what levels women are reaching in the organisation is really not the same as it is for the men. Now, I've since learned as well that this is also extremely common, and actually this is the largest driver of the pay gap. If you're looking at the UK gender pay gap methodology, is that difference in representation, that men are more represented at a higher level, higher paid roles than the women are. We could also see that the turnover rate for women greater than that for men in the organisation. But of course, diversity is far more than just gender. So that was my own starting point and how I came to understand it. But there is huge numbers of dimensions that we might want to consider diversity. And for an organisation, it's a real decision to make. Where do we focus? Because there's so much potentially that we can be thinking about. And I would definitely suggest, we can't do all of this at once. It's not appropriate to ask every question of everybody and not make use of that data. From GDPR principles alone, we only should be working with and asking for data that we can actually make use of and put to benefit of the people we're asking these questions about. So there's a real need to be able to focus and decide, what data are we actually going to collect? What will we be able to measure? And how are we going to use that data. So diversity data, I kind of see as the entry point that many organisations make to being able to measure diversity, equity and inclusion. But actually, in a way, this is the slowest moving measure. You know, it's like this, the most lagging of all of the indicators of how an organisation's doing. So within my organisation that I mentioned before, actually quite a big organisation, they've been working for years now to make change, and they've probably changed the percentage of women up by about 4 or 5 percentage points over a decade. Okay, they've been working hard, they've actually made very rapid change in an awful lot of regards, but that representation figure is very slow to change when you're looking at the actual turnover and recruitment rates within an organisation. So, you know, we can break down organisations in different ways to understand a bit more about how diversity interacts in the organisation. So starters, leavers, I think are very useful measures to be looking at. They're things that change a bit more rapidly. You know, we can say, well, we have an aim to have 50% of our new starters be women, for example, and that's something that we can actually see changing much more quickly than the overall representation. We can aim that the leavers and the turnover is equal across different demographic groups as an indicator actually that the organisation is fair and equal experience for the people within it. We can also look across the organisation by what type of job people are doing, and as we saw on this previous slide, you know, what level of seniority they've got to. And these kind of take representation a bit further, so we can then start to infer, well, what are our progression rates like? You know, what are the opportunities like within the production roles versus the non-production roles? And can we start to examine some of the areas of difference and maybe highlight things that can be different so that we can actually achieve the results that we're aiming for? So next type of measures that I like to work with are inclusion measures. So you can see I just sort of follow around the acronym here. So the inclusion measures are very much about people's perceptions and feelings of how they work. And this can be information that's gathered, for example, through an employee engagement survey or even a direct diversity and inclusion survey. And once we have that diversity data, we can disaggregate and we can understand, do different groups feel the same about the organisation? And I can pretty much guarantee you'll find that they don't all feel the same about the organisation, and it will highlight areas of difference that you can then use to focus in your efforts about how to make impactful change to improve the experience or to level up that experience for those who aren't kind of achieving the experience that you would hope for them. So this is totally made up data, by the way. This isn't actually a real data set, but it's very much representative of what real ones do look like. And there's a few measures that I tend to use that kind of based on research of the things that people tend to experience differently. So overall engagement is obviously a useful one, since that's what your survey is measuring as its key measure. But some of the other ones that stand out, do people feel heard and recognised? Do they feel equally valued at work? Do they feel like the organisation is fair? This is usually an interesting one. You know, the perceptions of fairness almost always differ. Do they believe that they're not going to be discriminated against? What do they see from their leaders' behaviours? Actually, the perception of representation is also really interesting, because I've seen that even when organisations are making lots of effort towards inclusion, people very much need to see people like themselves represented in roles that they consider to be successful, to believe that that is actually a possibility and that people can make that kind of progress. So the other one that I have there is well-being. You know, how do people experience well-being in the organisation? And this question could well be one that, you know, then highlights comments, Alan, like your colleague, can really show some of those differences in how, you know, they are feeling in their community as well as in the workplace and their overall kind of well-being. So the survey is one of those ways that we can find this stuff. We can also do focus groups and talk to people directly. And in fact, I'd totally recommend that you do, and just use the survey as a means to highlight what those questions to ask them and the topics of conversation actually are. And direct feedback, you know, especially where you have employee groups and people are able to raise their voice collectively, that makes it quite a safe way to be able to share that feedback, to understand some of those experiences. Now, these final measures, the equity measures, I would say are actually the quickest to change. So whilst diversity measures are the first ones often that come to mind, the equity measures are often the things that are most directly influenced by the actions that you take. So are people paid fairly for doing the same job? As an example, do you have the same promotion rates for people regardless of background? What kind of attraction are you achieving in your talent acquisition efforts? And do people come through that pipeline evenly? You know, do those proportions stay the same throughout the pipeline all the way through to hiring? What kind of development opportunities do people have in terms of coaching or training or kind of workshops or activities that help further their professional development? So probably, you know, talking to this audience, you will all recognize that this isn't a one-person job. You know, working with all of this data is, you know, a collective effort of many. Being able to collect it in the first place requires support, often from the most senior levels in the organization, because it's sensitive. If you have a diversity and inclusion team or person, they will of course be involved. Now, working with data that is sensitive and asking people to share this really is underpinned by trust. If they don't trust that the organization will keep it private, will use it responsibly, won't share it with their manager, or have any potential backlash, I guess, from having shared that information. You know, could somebody learn something about them they don't want to be known that causes them to receive or be on the receiving end of discrimination? You know, they need to trust that none of the negative risks are going to happen and that it's all for their benefit. So actually the communication around requesting that data is really important. Legal team involved for privacy considerations, you know, particularly kind of GDPR in the EU, but other countries have similar laws as well if you're a multinational firm. Systems need to be set up to hold the data and to be able to keep it properly access controlled so that only the people who need to see that data can see it. And if you have employee groups, I think it's a very good idea to involve those as part of that discussion process, so you can get that feedback and iteration on what's being asked, why and how, and really to help create that environment that is going to feel safe for employees to be sharing their info. So I think in many ways, working with people data is just like working with any other type of data. You know, it's all about gaining insights that help address, you know, some business need. And, you know, like any other type of data, you need somebody who, you need a team who are able to manage the full life cycle of that data, from collecting it, how it's stored, how it's reported, how it's analysed, how it's distributed, and how it's disposed of. Now, GDPR's got expectation of retention periods built in. You know, we need to make sure that we do actually have policy around retention and uphold that policy and it is actually enacted. Like other types of data, you need to have the skills in-house to be able to manipulate it, to visualize it, to do analysis on it, to do modeling with it. I'd say actually an awful lot of things that you can do with people data doesn't require very sophisticated data manipulation skills. An awful lot of it's often in the cleanup, might span multiple systems and bringing the data together to actually be able to create a coherent data set to do the analysis on is often far more time consuming than what the analysis itself will actually be. Security and access, really important. And I would tend to recommend that, you know, people's managers shouldn't see personal information about themselves. It should just be used for that statistical analysis purpose, unless there's a reason that the manager would need to be involved for some particular support. And I've talked about as well before the need for clarity and communication, to be able to present very clearly, you know, what's important, what's going to be done with it, and actually these are the results that we found, and this is what we're going to do, the action we're going to take as a result of it. So that's kind of how working with people data is similar to working with any other types of data, but it does have additional considerations, of course, because we're asking people to share things that are personal and sensitive about themselves. So actually gaining their trust to disclose their information is totally fundamental. In terms of your analysis, you may want to set a threshold for what disclosure rate you actually reach before you'd actually start to use that data as well for any statistical kind of purposes. Something that can pose interesting challenges if you're a global organization or you span kind of multiple countries, the different definitions in different countries of different characteristics. Ethnicity is one that's been a challenge, I guess, that I've grappled with in other organizations, where, of course, the meaning of race and ethnicity varies by different country. And so the categorizations and even the understanding of what is meant by the word race and what is meant by the word ethnicity are different. So looking at how to combine that data, or maybe looking at how you treat it separately, is a consideration that you'll need to make. There's different cultural norms and expectations about how we speak about these things across the world, and different laws that we also need to be aware of as we're asking for the data. So in terms of the law in the EU, GDPR, I'm sure most of you are aware, is the main kind of privacy and data protection law, but we also need to be thinking about employment law often, and about equal opportunities law. So when asking for the data, we need to think about the risk of having the data. Is it necessary to have the data? Is it proportional in terms of what we're asking for? And finally, kind of the ethics of asking for this data. You know, are we actually doing what is in the best interests of the employees? Is this a necessary piece of work? More and more, I guess, people tech is becoming automated. There's more and more autonomous decision-making and AI influence within these tools, you know, around candidate tracking, applicants, sometimes around skills, sometimes, well, all kinds of areas, right? As soon as we've got this sensitive personal data potentially feeding into a system that makes autonomous decisions, we need to be really careful about monitoring that those systems are working in the ways that we expect, and they continue to work in the ways that we expect, regardless of whether the decisions or suggestions made by these systems come from a system rather than a person. As an organization, it's still the organization that is responsible for the outcomes of that. And I think that's something that's not often understood. The AI isn't necessarily objective or fair or unbiased, but it's the organization's responsibility to make sure that the outcomes are. So within this kind of ethics category, I've put down about the importance of being transparent about how the data is used, the decisions that are made around it. This can be a particularly difficult thing with AI systems that aren't necessarily transparent or explainable. So people have got the right for an explanation of decisions that are made about them, and rights to have their data deleted as well. So, you know, be very careful around, you know, the things that are done with the data to make sure that they are accurate and reliable, and that it's actually a valid technique for the thing that you're trying to measure. Often the case, you know, big claims are made aren't necessarily actually based on scientific evidence, particularly in the kind of AI kind of domain. Right, so I'm just going to move on for kind of final slides, just to talk about an example of a process and how it looks to develop a pay gap report from start to finish for a topic that you would have no data on from the beginning. So this is a process for creating an ethnicity pay gap report that I've followed. It took a year, so it's a big process, starting from no data to being able to report publicly. So, you know, the place to start is with the data protection team, you know, really understanding the implications and risks of asking for this data. Once, you know, you've got through those considerations, you know, then we need to do technical setup, make sure that the systems are ready for it. Now, the internal engagement campaigns, I think, is probably one of the most important things to be doing, you know, explaining to people what's going to happen and why, and how it's going to be used and what is going to be done with the assessment of that. So all of this needs to happen before we actually start then asking people to share their data and analyse the data. Now, as I've said, analysing the data is often actually one of the simpler pieces in these types of processes. So from there, you've got the analysis, working out an action plan needs to happen, and then that gets written into the report text. And again, I'd recommend at this point, socialise it internally, get good discussion with teams, with employee groups, to really understand what those results are, what it means to them before taking it into a formal publication stage. But I hope that gives a kind of an overview of the broad steps involved in that process. And that is the end of my presentation.